Hey there, and welcome to Into the Terminal, episode 55. Today we're going to be talking about installing Red Hat Enterprise Linux 9 step by step. And of course, installing RHEL 9 wouldn't be complete without my trusty co-host, Mr. Scott McBrien. So today we are looking at installing RHEL 9.1. Keep in mind that we don't typically make breaking changes between major versions, so this process will work for 9.0, 9.1, and eventually 9.2 and beyond. So what we've got here is a virtual machine with the RHEL 9.1 installer. And Scott, did we grab the full install ISO or did we grab the boot install?
We grabbed the DVD ISO.
Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more towards the end of the show about the differences between the two. But for now, why don't we just go ahead and step through and take a look. First thing you'll want to do is select, obviously, your install language and your keyboard layout. Might be a little difficult to install RHEL 9 with if you read Chinese and you're trying to do so with English. So it's great to have that right up front. Now, if we hit continue, right around RHEL 7, I believe, we moved away from a linear install path where it asked you a question, you answer it, move on to the next, to more of what we call a hub and spoke model. So what this is basically the menu that you see here, with the ability to go and a lot of times you'll need to maybe register your system in order to select the software packages to install. And sometimes then you realize that you need to set up your network and your host name. So it's nice to have this menu laid out to where you can pick something, set it up, and then move on. Or if maybe you don't need to address certain issues, you don't actually have to click next through those. So as for the critical path today, why don't we just step through what we see here, and then in the deeper dive, we'll look at actually making configurations. So first off is localization. That's sort of an extension of what we saw on the first screen. This affects the system, so the end state. So I can't think of a situation where you might be, maybe you have a contractor who speaks a different language who's doing the install, but your systems administrators on the other side speak a different language. So you can actually choose the time zone, the keyboard, and the language support for the in-state system, so post-install. Under software, we have Connect to Red Hat. We'll talk about that a little bit more in depth in the deeper dive. So that's connecting to Red Hat. That's subscribing your systems. That's making sure that you have the system purpose set, that you have the appropriate software subscriptions, and you can also register to Insights. Installation source. This is in case you want to boot into the installer, but perhaps you want to use the CDN, so Red Hat's remote repositories, to install your packages. A lot of times you'll just go with local media. So we have an ISO here. We just downloaded it this morning, so we have the latest available installer. But there may be situations where you want to choose the CDN instead. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Software selection. So one of the things that has changed over the last few years with Red Hat Enterprise Linux is the fact that we no longer have separate ISOs for separate builds. We used to have a workstation installer and a server installer. Forget some of the others that we had, but now it's all one single installer to rule them all. And so you can actually go into the software selection and pick the types of packages that you want. So if you want to have a server with a GUI, don't ever do server with a GUI. It's a bad idea. But you can.
Disagree. It's
really?
The default. Yeah. But we could discuss it in deeper dive.
I sense another episode of Into the Terminal coming along. But anyway, you can choose between doing a workstation or a server with or without a GUI if you're part of the Sith organization, whatever you want to call the Sith. You might install a GUI with your server. And then the final category there is installation destination. So this is disk layouts and partitioning. Kdump, which is kernel dump, and then network host name and security profile. So security profile is basically, do I need the system to meet a certain set of criteria? And And then finally, we can create a user and a root password if we so chose. So that is a very, very quick flyover of the installer menu. We can make our settings, and you notice across the bottom of the install screen that it'll let us know that there's a few things that are absolutely required before we can proceed with the installation. But that's just a quick tour of the hub and spoke install menu. Scott, anything to add before we jump into the deeper dive?
Just that when we talk about a step-by-step install, right, we selected the language for the installer, which got populated here into the keyboard and language support in the hub and spoke. And then the only other questions we have to answer are where we want to install it. So it's going to ask us some disk layout questions, and the root password, or creating a user account on the system if you're not going to have a root user. After we answer those two questions, we can click begin the install and it'll install, right? So as far as getting from nothing to installed system, it's a couple of questions. But there's other things that you might want to customize down in these sub selections, and that's what we're going to spend some time talking about in the deeper dive.
Awesome. So we're going to go ahead and transition into the second half of the show. This is the point where you really want to make sure you jump into chat, ask your questions live, and we'll go into some of these menus. And if all goes well, by the end of the episode, we'll actually have a running RHEL 9 system ready to go. Well, we are plugging right along with step-by-step install of Red Hat Enterprise Linux 9. Today we're focused on 9.1 on Into the Terminal. So Scott, how's life been? How's things?
Oh, always busy, but I'm ready to answer those two questions so that we can then talk about the other things too.
Awesome. Well, make sure you join us live and answer and ask your questions, and we'll make sure we cover those live on air. So, with that said, do we want to address the red things first, or do we want to just kind of start on the left and work our way across?
Yeah, let's start with the red things first. So, when you click on the root or the user information, if we just say done. Let me take that back. Let's put in the root password. It will qualify like how good of a password that is. Mine is not very good. It's Red Hat. Don't tell anyone. But the other two options that you have is locking the root account and allowing SSH login with password. In the earlier version of RHEL 9, allowing SSH with password was disabled. So if you want to permit it, we now have a checkbox where you can go, yeah, root should be able to log into my machine using SSH. But notice that by default, that is disabled. Same thing with locking the root account. So right now, root could log into the machine, but maybe you want to enforce that people should use their normal user account and things like sudo to become and execute tasks as root, and that would be why you would lock the root account by default. But if you do that, you have to remember to add other users to this machine. Otherwise, you'll run into some problems.
Right. Yeah. And if you've been following the upstream, Fedora has had this in place for several major releases now. And as a former sysadmin who usually has a team of other systems administrators that I work alongside, this was an awesome change right out of the box. I love that that we can lock the root account and focus on using sudoers files, especially when you tie that into things like automation. You don't have to necessarily have a root account live on the system.
So the other thing we need to fix before we can just hit next and have a very simplistic, easy installation experience is the installation destination. So this is just so that you can confirm that the selected drive is where we should put our software. Because Eric, what would happen if the selected drive had other data on it?
Sorry, I didn't catch your question. I was dealing with some hiccups in the chat.
So let's say the selected drive here had other data on it.
Mhm.
What would happen to that other data with our installation?
So if we had any important data on here, that data would actually be destroyed pretty much unrecoverably by the new file system that we're laying down.
Yeah. And so that's why it's a required thing, is we want to make sure that you know what you're selecting and you've approved it before we carry forward.
Yeah,
So I
don't
could just
accidentally install your operating system on your data disk.
right.
Not that I've ever done that before.
And this machine is very simplistic. It only has one disk attached to it, so we can be pretty assured like which disk we're talking about because there's only one listed. And then down under the storage configuration, by default, it selects automatic, which means that you'll get a logical volume managed layout with a slash file system, some swap, and you'll also get a boot file system. But if you want to, you could do a custom, and maybe we'll come back to that in a little bit. Encrypt my data. So this is, you can put in a password to encrypt your file system. It uses a technology behind the scenes called Lux, L-U-K-S. But when you boot the machine, you will have to type in that password every time you boot in order to unencrypt that data so we can then use it to boot the machine. So that's why it says if you check it, you'll set the passphrase next, and then you'll remember that passphrase, because if you forget it, you now have an encrypted file system that you don't have the ability to unlock anymore. So yeah, but notice all I did was I entered in here. I haven't changed anything, and I'm just going to click done. And that's good enough to answer my question to take the default selections. All right, so at this point, we could click begin installation and actually start partitioning and putting down packages. But Eric, maybe we should address our disagreement in critical path a little bit on software selection.
So I started my career with servers with GUIs, and it really opened up a lot of vulnerabilities that in a server situation you probably don't need, especially in a world with automation. And probably one of my favorite tools available to RHEL now is the web console. So in today's day and age with the cockpit web console, there's not much that I can't do either between the web UI or the command line. So nowadays, my strong recommendation is to not use a GUI, to not even install the GUI unless you absolutely need it. Now, I think what Scott may be alluding to is back in the day, there was certain application suites that required a GUI, so you can either set up like not VNC, but X forwarding, and connect to your system through SSH, and then go with that, or like my first Linux job was managing Linux servers that ran Oracle databases, and Oracle was one of those that required having a graphical desktop in order to install. But for the most part, not a lot of application suites require that anymore. So my recommendation would be no GUI unless you absolutely have a solid requirement for it.
All right, so I'm watching the chat and I'm seeing some commentary there as well. So here's my first statement. Decisions you make now in the installer, especially around software, can be changed later. If you selected something that you didn't mean to select, you can uninstall it once the machine is installed. If you get to the installed machine and you realize that you forgot something, you can put it into place after the machine is installed, right? So like knowing exactly what you need is not always necessary. Okay. And here's why I say server with GUI is the default, and for some people, maybe it should stay the default. Eric, in the critical path, you talked about the fact that we used to provide different content sets for different distributions of RHEL or builds of RHEL, and that's not the case anymore. So let's say that you are a workstation user and you use graphical tools like AutoCAD software. you will want a GUI. And server with a GUI is how you get there, right? So basically, server with a GUI is you get some base Linux packages and a GUI.
Isn't there a workstation option within software
You know what?
selection though?
Let's look.
I want to feel dumb being the workstation guy if there's not a workstation. How about that?
And so really the differential between workstation and server with GUI is not huge. But workstation would definitely have a graphical user interface. So we keep it the default for a reason. For people who are new, who may not know what they want to do with the system yet, it might be running as a virtual machine on their desktop. Server with a GUI is probably what they want. But if you are more expert and you know that that's not what you want, then make it not what you want. And then pick the other things that you want, right? So the reason that it's the default is to keep it easy that fits a variety of people's desires for workload. And so by making a blanket statement like never install the GUI, I don't know, like maybe you should never install the GUI if you're a person that manages systems in a data center. I could see that qualification being very true. You probably don't want to install server with GUI if your boxes are operating in a data center in the cloud where you're not going to be using that GUI anyway.
Well, I want to stick with the crowd on this one. Server no GUI, and I will die on that hill if I have to.
Fair enough. The other thing that you can do here is not only change kind of the packaged install, right? So we have server with GUI, just server, which is server without a GUI, minimal, which is a very small selection of packages. It's like 400 packages. Workstation, which is similar to server with GUI, but also includes some things like power management and some other random bits. Virtualization host includes things like the virtual machine management that comes in Web Console by default in its package list. Or you can pick kind of a base layer like server and then come over here and just pick the additional things you want, right? So maybe you also want file and storage server because you'll be doing some NFS file systems. And maybe you want some, maybe we're going to be doing, well, I don't want to do NIST, that's dumb. Performance tools. Everybody likes performance tools. We can put those on there for diagnosing misbehaving things. Maybe we also need a web server on this box. So you can go through and select the packages that you want out of this list as well. That was a spirited debate.
It's one of the few times where I have a very passionate stance and I'm going to stick with it. So maybe the next thing we want to do is set network and host name. One of the reasons why I suggest doing that before we go register the system is so that when we register it, it has the host name that we want it to have. Iron sysadmin just backed me up and said no GUIs on servers. So the Iron sysadmin has spoken. So we want to give this a host name, and a lot of times your system will actually pull a DHCP address, and so you want to make sure that you pull an IP. And Eric is, I can't read that, but I'll assume it's a compliment. So we'll want to set a host name and apply it, and then we can click done. And that'll set our networking and host name requirements as well. Let's see. So we've got our languages. Now I know Scott's out in Atlanta, so we'll stick with Eastern time. We've set a root password. We've got our network and host name. We've got our disk partitions. We've got our software packages. Let's go ahead and register our system. Then we'll deal with some of the edge cases here on the right-hand column here. So what this is basically asking for your username and password to access.redhat.com. The other way you can go about it is using an activation key. But for now, we've got an account that we share on the TMM team that allows us to register our systems. We can also set a system purpose. This basically allows you to say that the system is a dev box or the system is a production server. And it allows us to select what level of support that we want. Excuse me. Then one of my favorite features on the screen is the ability to go ahead and register with Insights. If you're unaware, Insights is a monitoring and analytics platform, software as a service that will let you know if your system is over or under provisioned, or if there's CVEs that affect your system. We've got other episodes of Into the Terminal where we talk more about that, but this allows you to register the system to Insights right from the install. So once we have the permissions that once we've put in our username, password, selected register to Insight or connect to Insights, we can go ahead and click register, and the system will log in and ensure that we have subscription entitlements available.
Yeah, and under the options, there's a couple of additional things. If you're in a larger organization where you use Red Hat Satellite to maintain systems, you would want to register your system potentially to Satellite instead of to the Red Hat hosted network infrastructure.
Oh yeah, great point.
Or if you have to use a HTTP proxy in order to get outside your firewall or local network. So those are what the options are for there. Uh-oh.
So good PSA, it does require an active password. So you can't just type in any password. Unless that's your password.
Well, it helps.
Any password is your
If it
password.
helps if you type it correctly. That's usually the problem for me.
It is a Friday afternoon. Can you all tell? And so now that we've registered our system, you notice that the install source is actually updating to the Red Hat CDN, so we will get the absolute latest packages, and it may require us to go in and revalidate our software selection choices that we made. We'll come back to that to make sure that the system gets everything pulled down that it needs to. But meantime, I had a question for you, Scott. Pretty much all of my systems are beefy enough that I don't worry about it anymore. But Kdump is for kernel dump. It's basically if kernel panics, it'll actually dump all the configurations and whatnot to a file. Are you pro or opposed to Kdump?
So I think it depends. So are you actually going to take the resulting Kdump and attach it to a support case, or use debugger information to try and troubleshoot why that kernel panicked and failed? If the answer is no, I'm not going to do that, then don't enable Kdump. Because why would you spend resources of your disk to have these giant files that get dropped there when you're not going to utilize them? If
fair.
You are going to do that because you are a Red Hat subscriber with something other than a self-support subscription, then Kdump is a way that if you're having kernel panics, if you're having kernel problems on the machine, you can upload that file to Red Hat via a support case, and they will do some analysis on it to try and figure out what is causing that kernel error. So that would be my guidance. Are you actually going to use it or not? So if you're a self-support person and you have no intention of using the debuggers on your own to go through it, then disable it.
That's a good point. Now I'm going to go into my home lab and disable Kdump everywhere. But Kdump is one of those things that, looking back to our server GUI conversation, we could actually install and enable later on down the road, right?
Yeah, you can always enable Kdump later if you change your mind. This is just what we look like out of the box. Remember, everything that we do here in the installer can be updated or changed later, right? So if we make a mistake or we're unhappy with a choice that we've made, generally we can make another choice on the installed machine. Depending on how poorly that is, sometimes that's more or less effort. But yeah, nothing here is the end of the world. And if you decide to reinstall the machine, it's also not the end of the world. It doesn't take very long to do.
So that pretty well takes us through everything, unless we want to scroll down and create a user account real quick. And then we'll wrap up the conversation with security profiles.
Yeah, so the individual users are on, I think, the next page where it's actually installing packages. So I think we've covered everything except for security profile.
Awesome. Yeah, and so this comes into play when you have maybe government security requirements, or maybe you're processing credit cards, at which point you'd want something like PCI compliance, or you've got one that I worked with a lot early on was HIPAA. So what this will do is it'll actually configure your system ahead of time to excuse me, to be compliant with certain security requirements. It'll also, as you notice on the CIS that certification that Scott has selected here, that'll actually give us a number of warnings saying that, hey, your system configuration through the installer isn't set up correctly. So we see a lot of points to file systems like /home and /temp, which a lot of security organizations required to have those different partitions separated out into their own volume, or those directories separated out into their own partitions. And so it'll actually go in and let us know that, hey, you need to create /temp, you need to create /home. It'll also show us that there's a number of packages that need to either be excluded or included into our install.
Yeah, and so remember earlier I was saying that there's really no choices that you can't undo later. This is the exception to that statement, of course. So you can create additional file systems like home and temp and var on a running installed machine, but it is a tremendous amount of effort. So what we have just done here is I selected the security profile I'm interested in, I applied it to the machine, and then it looked at my installation choices, and it said, hey, these are things that are not compliant. And in fact, if we go back to the main homepage for the installer, notice it doesn't let me begin the installation. It will not let me advance until I resolve those blocker issues like having the right file system layout. And if I do fix that and then come back into the security profile and have it retest it and everything's fine, then I can go and continue my installation. This is not the end of your security posturing. This is the start. So oftentimes these security profiles like CIS, Disastig, Australian Essential 8, they have things that you make choices at install time, like file system layout, which is what we're testing here in the installer. But then you also have a whole bunch of process and procedure and management stuff that you do after the machine is installed. Like, how do we manage users? That's something that we don't select at install time. It's something that we have to apply either procedurally within our organization, or we have to customize some properties of a user after the machine has been installed when we're installing and maintaining user accounts. Things like sudo rules and management. There's nothing in the installer about how we do super user configuration. That's all done post-install. So this is one half of the security compliance piece of it. The others is still to be done after the machine is installed.
Let's go ahead
All
and
right,
scroll
so
all the way down here because I'm
yep,
pretty sure that you can create users on this part of the installer now.
it's not scrolling anymore.
Your little bar there is only halfway down though. I'm almost certain that user accounts is below root password.
I'm scrolling as hard as I can. Look at it. It's not going any further.
All right. Well, then let's create or let's click begin install.
Okay. Did we want to do any additional file system stuff before we move on?
I'm good. Is there something you want to?
There was a
Iron
question in
sysadmin
there
says scroll
about,
harder.
yeah. I mean, I literally cannot push any harder. There was a question about swap space, and maybe we can address some of that because that's more philosophical, I guess, at this point, while the packages are installing.
Sure. Yeah, let's go ahead and click begin install. And yeah, see, there's no create user. It was down there below somewhere.
Or maybe it happens after. We'll see. We will find out today. So by default, the file systems, as we talked about, were logical volume managed. That's why you see the dev mapper stuff. We choose XFS file system as the default format. Both those things can be changed there on the previous page of the installer. And then JSCAR asked about swap. So there are now a variety of places where we run Red Hat Enterprise Linux and Linux in general without swap space. Cloud images is a great example of that. If you look at the Amazon AMI or the Azure RHEL images available in the marketplace, or Google images available in the marketplace, or pretty much anywhere else, they're not going to include a swap file system. So let's roll back time like 12 years ago when I was like, I don't care about this box. I don't need swap. That's just a waste of disk space. There were times where my machine would kernel panic because it was doing something to try and access swap space and couldn't, and would kernel panic. But over the intervening like 12 or 15 years since I last did that, there's been a lot of effort to remove the requirement for swap from the Linux kernel. So now we can very reliably run the machine without swap. But what are you giving up? Swap is a memory augmentation. So if we are trying to create space and memory for application data or application binaries or libraries, and we don't have any RAM available, we don't have any cache that we can deallocate and reallocate to those purposes, that's where swap is useful. We take that memory and we put it out to a swap space so that we now have more RAM for this other thing. And the stuff that we swap out are things that are generally not used by an application. So there's certain things that aren't eligible for swap space. But doing that activity, we're basically taking a chunk of this memory content that the system and applications expect to be really fast because it's stored in memory, and we're putting on something that's really slow. And so what will end up happening is as we try to recall that memory back into RAM and write other stuff back out, that can cause application performance issues because it's taking so long to retrieve and utilize that data. So when you look at things like database workloads, they want to be really, really conservative on swap usage. They don't want to use it at all if they can avoid it, because it'll cause things like database queries to be much longer than expected and hamper the apps waiting on that database query to resolve that we have to swap in from swap space. The downside is when you're out of RAM when you're not running swap space, then you're out of RAM. And you'll actually get errors when you try to like create a new application or run a command that there is no memory available for you to do that. So that's what you give up, is this like buffer by not having swap space. And in the cloud, we're okay with that because we just like rip the Band-Aid off, throw it away, and get a new box. That's good enough. I'm regretting my decision to move to the CDN because it's taking much longer than I would have expected.
So if you have any questions, feel free to throw them into chat. Let's see. It's what, 67% done?
Yeah, it's downloading all the RPMs, which of course are already on the installation DVD that I attached to this machine. So yeah, there's that. The nice thing about installing in is that you get the latest stuff. So if there were like 0-day packages that were released that were not included in the installation media, you actually get them from the CDN.
So one thing I will say is we made some assumptions with this episode. We assumed that you already had the install media. We made the assumption that you have a VMware player, whether that's Parallels, VirtualBox, or libvirt on a Linux machine. And then one of the other things we made an assumption of was that you've gone ahead and created a virtual machine with sufficient CPU, RAM, that you've mounted the ISO to that virtual machine, or maybe a bare metal server, and inserted either the DVD or USB stick. Now, I believe on an earlier episode of Into the Terminal, we covered how to do those things using VirtualBox. I'll make sure to find that link and add it to the show notes. As we're kind of wrapping up here, go ahead and point out that if you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. Hit that bell to let you know whenever we go live. That way, you can join us live. There, as you can tell, there's often spirited conversations going on. So I believe next Friday we'll be talking about virtual machine management. So we'll talk a little bit more about how to use the command line to manage these systems. So if you want to use QEMU and libvirt to manage your virtual machines, that's actually how I run things here in my home lab. So definitely tune in a week from now, noon Eastern, to talk about virtual machine management.
Oh, Eric.
That's all I got, Scott. I tried to vamp through all of the download, but it looked like it might have hiccuped.
Yeah, I was going to say we may never know the answer to when we add users because it looks like this virtual machine has like died in the middle of installation.
And that's why you like having the install media with all the packages on it, because you never know when your internet provider will be like, it's just not working today.
I actually think it may be my virtualization provider, because I updated my virtualization packages this morning based off an OS update that I installed last week.
Well, that would do it. Don't ever run system updates the day of a live stream. That's some free information for you. We are a bit over time, so I think we'll go ahead and wrap this episode here. We'll respond back in the comments when you actually get to create user accounts and whether or not our install was successful or not. If one of you finds it before I do, be sure to post that in the comments. We love to get back to you all, answer questions, and if you can prove my boss wrong in YouTube comments, I mean that's like 100 free RHEL coins. I'll send your way. I don't know what RHEL coins are or what they're worth, but we'll send some to you. Anyway, thank you all for joining us live. Definitely appreciate the engagement in chat. Love to have a conversation because that I think that's more valuable than Scott and or I just sitting on a stream and talking about how to do a thing. But definitely like and subscribe, share with a friend, and we will catch you in a week. Scott, thank you so much. And on behalf of the Red Hat Enterprise Linux team, thank you all for joining us.